Most accounts of the Korean War focus on fronts, armistice lines, and the moment the fighting froze into stalemate. What is far less discussed is how survival itself reshaped military thinking in the frozen hills of the peninsula. The war did not only test weapons and doctrines, it exposed the limits of industrial armies, when heat, concealment, and endurance became more decisive than firepower. One of the quiet lessons carried out of Korea was not about tanks or artillery, but about something far more basic: how to stay warm without being seen. During the early winters of the conflict, troops on all sides learned that a single plume of smoke could undo weeks of careful concealment. Artillery observers did not need radar or satellites. Smoke alone was enough. What emerged in response was an adaptation rooted in older Soviet experience, an almost invisible stove system designed to burn hot, burn clean, and leave nothing in the sky to mark a position. Before continuing, if this kind of overlooked military history matters to you, consider subscribing to History Vault. This channel exists to preserve the lessons that standard narratives leave behind. The Korean War forced armies to relearn lessons about cold that modern war had obscured. By 1950, most industrial militaries believed they had solved logistics. Fuel could be shipped, rations could be standardized, and cold weather gear could be issued at scale. But, Korea dismantled that confidence. The peninsula's winters were harsher than planners expected, and, supply chains, especially for forces operating away from ports, were fragile. For troops aligned with Soviet Union interests, including advisors and material support flowing to North Korean and later Chinese forces, the problem was actually quite familiar. Soviet doctrine had been shaped not only by large mechanized battles, but by survival under conditions where detection meant annihilation. Heating was never a comfort issue. It was a tactical one. Cold injuries, weapon malfunctions, and exhaustion were as dangerous as enemy fire. Soldiers needed heat, but, heat created smoke. Smoke attracted attention. Attention brought artillery. The problem demanded a solution that could not rely on abundance or visibility. The Soviet experience had already proven that sometimes smoke could be deadlier than bullets. The conceptual roots of the smokeless stove do not begin in Korea. They actually trace back to the Second World War, especially on the Eastern Front and in the prolonged urban and forest fighting that really defined that conflict. Soviet troops learned early on that German air and artillery units were, quite adept at identifying camps by the telltale signs of cooking fires. Nowhere was this lesson more brutally reinforced than during the siege of Leningrad. Civilians and soldiers alike had to learn to cook and heat their spaces, using improvised systems that burned fuel completely, vented underground, or even reused exhaust heat in order to reduce visible emissions. Smoke in those desperate days was not just a giveaway, it was, quite frankly, a death sentence. By the late 1940s, these hard-won lessons had filtered into Soviet cold weather manuals. Heating systems were designed not for comfort, but for concealment. The goal was simple: extract every unit of heat from fuel before it could announce itself. The stove itself was less important than the system around it. What is often misunderstood is that the smokeless stove was not a single standardized object. It was a method, typically built from sheet metal, clay, or even repurposed ammunition containers. The stove was designed to force complete combustion. Airflow was carefully restricted, fuel was pre-dried, and exhaust was routed through long, often buried channels. These channels acted as heat exchangers. By the time exhaust gases reached the surface, they were cool enough to disperse invisibly. Some systems vented into snowbanks or soil layers that absorbed the remaining heat and filtered particulates. Others released exhaust horizontally at ground level, where it blended with the ambient air. The result was not smokeless in a technical sense, but, smoke neutral in a tactical one. Observers scanning ridgelines saw nothing unusual. Infrared detection did not yet exist at the scale required to counter this method, so the stove pretty much vanished into the landscape. Korean terrain made concealment as important as firepower. The Korean War, unfolded across steep hills, narrow valleys, and exposed ridgelines. Defensive positions were often dug into slopes where any sign of habitation could be seen from miles away. In winter, bare trees and snow made camouflage even harder. For forces trained under Soviet doctrine, or advised by those who were, smokeless heating became part of defensive engineering. Positions were not considered complete until heat could be maintained without visual indicators. This was especially critical for night survival, when cold sapped alertness and slowed reaction times. Western forces eventually recognized the same problem, but their solutions were slower to adapt. Early reliance on standard stoves and open fires led to predictable artillery strikes. Over time, improvised solutions emerged, but the Soviet approach had already systematized the problem. So the real innovation here was discipline, not technology, The effectiveness of these stoves depended on behavior just as much as design. Fuel had to be prepared properly, and fires had to be fed slowly. Any sudden temperature spikes could create visible exhaust. Soldiers were trained to treat heating as a controlled process, not just a convenience. This discipline, it really reflected the broader Soviet survival doctrine. Redundancy, concealment, and patience were always emphasized over speed or comfort. The stove was simply another expression of a mindset shaped by scarcity and attrition. It is telling that many veterans recalled these heating systems not as special equipment, but as standard practice. They were unremarkable precisely because they worked. Lessons from Korea quietly influenced later military and civilian survival thinking. It's interesting how these ideas, though not always in the spotlight, continued to shape strategies for years to come. After the Korean War, the smokeless heating concept did not disappear. Instead, it migrated, finding new relevance. Soviet civil defense planning, for example, incorporated similar principles for shelters, adapting and expanding on those earlier experiences. Rural populations were encouraged to use efficient low-smoke stoves not only for fuel conservation, but also, really, for wartime readiness. This practical approach served both everyday needs and the demands of uncertain times. In military doctrine, the emphasis on thermal discipline, controlling heat signatures, would later expand into infrared camouflage and emission management. The stove was an early recognition that detection does not require sound or movement. Heat itself is a signal. Survivalist communities in later decades rediscovered these ideas independently. Rocket stoves, earth-sheltered exhaust systems, and mass heaters all echo the same principle: burn clean, extract heat fully, and leave nothing visible behind. What this overlooked detail reveals about warfare is, honestly, more important than the device itself. The smokeless stove is a reminder that wars are not won only by decisive battles. They are endured through systems that keep people alive under pressure. The Korean War, forced militaries to confront the reality that modern weapons could not replace basic environmental adaptation. It also reveals how knowledge flows unevenly through history. Western narratives often focus on hardware and strategy, while Soviet experience emphasized endurance under deprivation. Understanding these smaller adaptations really deepens our understanding of the conflict itself. Korea was not just a geopolitical flashpoint, it was, in fact, a proving ground for survival in an age that perhaps a bit naively assumed technology had already solved such problems. Remembering these lessons matters because, well, they still apply. In a world where surveillance grows ever more sophisticated, the basic logic remains unchanged. Visibility creates vulnerability. Control over heat, light, and emissions is still central to survival, whether that's in military, humanitarian, or civilian contexts. The Soviet smokeless stove was not a miracle device. It was really a quiet acknowledgement of reality that sometimes the difference between life and death is whether the enemy knows you are there. If you value this kind of careful, detail-driven history, stories that explain how people actually lived, adapted, and endured, consider subscribing to History Vault. Share this video with others who appreciate history that looks beyond headlines and hardware and helps preserve the lessons that are, all too often, forgotten.